The night was unusually quiet for a Friday in Alexandria, Virginia, the kind of stillness that settles over suburban streets after the last commuters have returned home and the restaurants have closed their patios for the evening. A light rain had begun to fall around 10:30 p.m., leaving the asphalt slick and reflective under the amber glow of streetlights. It was the perfect night for staying home, for curling up with a book or watching late-night television, for forgetting that the world outside existed. But Marcus Ellison couldn't afford to stay home tonight. His mother had called 3 hours earlier from her assisted living facility in Richmond, her voice trembling, with the particular fear that only the elderly know. The fear of being alone when the body begins to fail. She had fallen in the bathroom, had managed to pull herself up and make it to the phone, but something felt wrong in her hip, and she was scared, and she needed her son. Marcus had dropped everything and headed south on Interstate 95, driving through the gathering darkness with the focus of a man who had spent his career making difficult decisions under pressure. At 61 years old, he had held some of the most demanding positions in the United States government, had briefed presidents and managed crises that the public would never know about, had sent men and women into danger and welcomed them home when they returned. But none of that mattered when your mother called and said she was scared. Some priorities transcended everything else. He had spent 4 hours at the facility, sitting beside her bed while the doctors examined her hip and determined that nothing was broken, just badly bruised. He had held her hand while she drifted off to sleep, had spoken with the night nurses about increasing their monitoring over the next few days, had done all the small things that sons do for mothers who are approaching the end of their journeys. And then, satisfied that she was stable, he had gotten back in his car for the 2-hour drive home. It was nearly 2:00 a.m. when he crossed back into Fairfax County. The roads empty except for occasional delivery trucks and the rare fellow traveler. The rain had intensified, drumming against his windshield in a steady rhythm that required his full attention on the road. His black Mercedes S-Class handled the conditions easily, its all-wheel drive system keeping him stable on the wet pavement. But Marcus drove carefully nonetheless. He was tired, emotionally drained, and old enough to know that fatigue and wet roads were a dangerous combination. He exited the interstate onto Route 7, heading toward the quiet neighborhood in McLean where he had lived for the past 15 years. The area was home to many of Washington's power brokers, current and former officials who valued the privacy and security that the tree-lined streets provided. Marcus's house was modest by the neighborhood's standards, a 4-bedroom colonial that he and his late wife had purchased when their children were still young. She had been gone for 5 years now, taken by cancer that had moved too fast for medicine to catch, and the house often felt too large for a man living alone. But he couldn't bring himself to sell it. Too many memories lived in those walls. The blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror without warning, a sudden explosion of color that cut through the rain and the darkness. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, the automatic response of any driver being pulled over, but he remained calm as he slowed and activated his turn signal. He had nothing to worry about. He wasn't speeding. His registration was current. His license was valid. This was probably just a routine check, a bored officer looking for drunk drivers on a rainy Friday night. He pulled onto the shoulder of Route 7, a stretch of road lined by commercial properties that were closed and dark at this hour. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water between his car and the patrol vehicle behind him. He put the Mercedes in park, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. It was a habit he had developed decades ago, an acknowledgement of the reality that traffic stops could be dangerous for everyone involved, especially for a black man in America. The officer approached his driver's side window, flashlight beam cutting through the rain. Marcus lowered his window, feeling the cold spray on his face, and looked up at the figure standing beside his car. The officer was young, mid-20s at most, with a pale face that was already set in an expression of suspicion. His name tag read Hendricks, and his hand was resting on the grip of his service weapon as he examined Marcus through the open window. "License and registration," Hendricks said, his tone flat and cold. "Of course, officer. My license is in my wallet in my jacket pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them slowly." Marcus moved with deliberate care, announcing each action before he took it. He had given this same advice to his own children when they were teenagers. had drilled into them the importance of keeping their hands visible, of moving slowly, of doing nothing that could be misinterpreted by a nervous officer with a gun. It was a conversation that black parents across America had with their children, a survival lesson that no one should have to learn. He retrieved his license and registration and handed them through the window. Hendricks examined the documents with his flashlight, his brow furrowing as he looked at the license. "Marcus Ellison, this your current address?" "Yes, officer. McLean." Hendricks looked from the license to Marcus, then back to the license, his expression shifting to something that Marcus recognized immediately. It was doubt, disbelief that the well-dressed black man in the expensive car actually belonged in the wealthy neighborhood listed on his license. "McLean," Hendricks repeated, the skepticism heavy in his voice. "Nice area. What do you do for work, Mr. Ellison?" Marcus felt a familiar weariness settling over him. He had encountered this before many times over the years, the assumption that his success must be illegitimate, that a black man driving a Mercedes must be a drug dealer or an athlete or a rapper, anything except what he actually was. "I work for the federal government." "Federal government? Doing what?" Marcus hesitated. His position was technically classified, not the kind of thing you mentioned casually to a police officer on the side of the road. But he also recognized where this conversation was heading, could see the trajectory of suspicion in Hendricks's eyes, and knew that the simplest path forward was to establish his identity clearly. "I'm the director of the Central Intelligence Agency." The words hung in the rain-filled air between them. Hendricks stared at him for a long moment, then let out a short, harsh laugh. "Right. The director of the CIA, and I'm the President of the United States." He shook his head, his expression hardening. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." "Officer, I'm happy to provide additional identification. I have my agency credentials in my briefcase in the back seat. If you'll just let me—" "I said step out of the vehicle now." Marcus felt his heart rate increasing, not from fear, but from the recognition that this situation was escalating in a direction he had hoped to avoid. He had seen too many videos of traffic stops gone wrong, too many black men who had done everything right and still ended up dead. He was the director of the CIA, yes, but right now he was just a black man on a dark road with a hostile police officer, and that made him as vulnerable as anyone. He opened the door slowly and stepped out into the rain, keeping his hands visible. The water soaked through his jacket immediately, plastering his graying hair to his forehead, running down his face like tears. He turned to face Hendricks, maintaining eye contact, trying to project calm authority despite the circumstances. "Officer Hendricks, I understand you're doing your job, but I am telling you the truth. I am Marcus Ellison, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. If you check your computer system, you'll find that my vehicle is flagged for exactly this kind of situation. There's a protocol—" "Shut up." Hendricks's hand was back on his weapon, his voice rising. "I've heard a lot of bullshit stories, but this might be the best one yet. The director of the CIA driving himself around at 2 a.m., with no security detail, no escort, nothing. You think I'm stupid? I think you're making assumptions based on incomplete information. I was visiting my mother in Richmond. She had a medical emergency. I drove myself because it was faster than arranging official transport. These things happen. I'm asking you to verify my identity through proper channels before this situation escalates further." Hendricks stepped closer, his face twisted with hostility. "What's escalating is your attitude, sir. You've got a nice car, nice clothes, fancy story about being some kind of government big shot. But you know what I see? I see a suspicious individual in an area known for drug activity, driving a vehicle that's probably stolen or bought with drug money, refusing to cooperate with a lawful police investigation. I've cooperated fully. I've provided my license and registration. I've exited the vehicle as requested. I've explained who I am and offered to provide additional identification. What more would you like me to do?" The question seemed to enrage Hendricks. His face reddened, his hand tightened on his weapon, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "What I'd like you to do is stop lying to me. The director of the CIA, give me a break. You people are always making up stories, always trying to talk your way out of things. You people, there it was. The phrase that stripped away any pretense of legitimate law enforcement and revealed the raw prejudice underneath. Marcus had heard those words before, many times over 6 decades of life in America. He had heard them as a child in Chicago, as a student at Howard University, as a young officer in the army, as a rising star in the intelligence community. He had heard them from strangers and colleagues, from friends who didn't realize they were being hurtful, from enemies who knew exactly what they were doing. The words never lost their sting, never became easy to absorb, never failed to remind him that no matter how high he climbed, some people would always see only the color of his skin. "Officer Hendricks, I'm going to ask you one more time to verify my identity through your computer system. My vehicle is registered with law enforcement databases specifically to prevent situations like this. If you run my plates, you'll see a flag that—" "I'm done listening to you." Hendricks drew his weapon and pointed it at Marcus's chest. "Get on the ground, now." The world seemed to slow down. Marcus looked at the gun barrel aimed at his heart, at the young man holding it, at the rain falling around them like a curtain separating them from the rest of the world. He thought about his mother in the hospital bed, about his children who would wake up tomorrow expecting their father to be alive, about all the things he still wanted to do and see and experience, and he thought about the choice facing him. He could comply, get on the wet ground, allow himself to be handcuffed and taken to a police station where his identity would eventually be verified and this nightmare would end. That was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that maximized his chances of surviving the next few minutes. But something in him rebelled against it. 61 years of navigating a world that doubted his worth, of proving himself again and again, of swallowing his pride and accepting indignities that no one should have to accept. 61 years of being told, in ways large and small, that he didn't belong, that his success was suspicious, that he should be grateful for whatever crumbs society chose to throw him. 61 years of doing everything right and still being treated like a criminal. He was tired, tired of the fear, tired of the accommodation, tired of the constant calculation required to move through a world that saw him as a threat before it saw him as a person. "No," he said, his voice calm and clear despite the gun pointed at his chest. "I will not get on the ground. I am the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I have committed no crime, and I will not be treated like a criminal by someone who is allowing his prejudice to override his judgment." Hendricks's face contorted with rage. "What did you say to me?" "I said no. And I'm telling you right now, officer, that if you don't lower that weapon and contact your supervisor immediately, you are going to regret this moment for the rest of your career. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. Within the next 60 seconds, you are going to receive a call from your dispatch. That call is going to instruct you to stand down immediately, and when that happens, I strongly suggest you comply." Hendricks laughed, a nervous sound that betrayed his uncertainty. "And why would that happen? You got some magic phone that calls people automatically?" "Something like that." What Hendricks didn't know, couldn't know, was that Marcus's vehicle was equipped with a silent alarm system connected directly to CIA security. The moment Hendricks had drawn his weapon, sensors in Marcus's clothing had detected the elevated threat level and transmitted an alert to the agency's operations center. Within seconds, analysts had identified his location, assessed the situation through satellite imagery, and initiated emergency protocols. The first call went to the Fairfax County Police Department's emergency line, identifying the situation and demanding immediate intervention. The second call went to the FBI's Washington field office, alerting them to a potential assault on a senior government official. The third call went to the Secret Service, which maintained protective responsibility for certain intelligence officials. Within 2 minutes of Hendricks drawing his weapon, more than a dozen agencies had been notified and were scrambling to respond. Marcus watched Hendricks's face as the seconds ticked by. He saw the uncertainty growing, the dawning realization that something was happening beyond the young officer's understanding. Hendricks's radio crackled to life, and he fumbled for it with his free hand while keeping his weapon trained on Marcus. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We need you to stand down immediately. I repeat, stand down immediately. Do not engage the individual. Supervisor is en route to your location." Hendricks's face went pale. "Dispatch. What's going on? I've got a suspicious individual here who— Unit 47, I need you to listen very carefully. The individual you have stopped is who he says he is. You need to holster your weapon and step back from the vehicle right now. Do you understand?" Do you understand, Unit 47? Hendricks' hand was trembling now, the gun barrel wavering. He looked at Marcus with new eyes, the first crack of doubt appearing in his certainty. "Copy, dispatch, standing down." He holstered his weapon slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was doing. Marcus remained still, his hands visible, watching the transformation unfold. The aggression was draining from Hendricks' face, replaced by something that looked like fear. "Sir, I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what, Officer Hendricks? That a black man couldn't possibly be telling the truth? That someone who looks like me must be a criminal?" Hendricks said nothing, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the rain, growing louder by the second. Within moments, the stretch of Route 7 was flooded with vehicles, patrol cars, and unmarked sedans, converging from every direction. Men and women in suits emerged despite the rain, their badges identifying them as FBI, Secret Service, and other agencies that Hendricks probably didn't even know existed. A man in his 50s approached, wearing the insignia of a Fairfax County police captain. His face was grim as he took in the scene. The young officer standing pale and trembling, the director of the CIA soaked and standing beside his luxury sedan, the obvious tension between them. "Director Ellison," the captain said, his voice heavy with deference and concern. "I'm Captain William Torres. On behalf of the Fairfax County Police Department, I want to apologize profusely for what's happened here tonight. Are you all right?" "Physically, I'm fine, Captain. Emotionally, I'm exactly as you'd expect a 61-year-old man to be after having a gun pointed at his chest, because a police officer couldn't believe that a black man might be telling the truth about his identity." Torres winced, the words landing like blows. He turned to Hendricks, who seemed to be shrinking with each passing moment. "Officer Hendricks, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Hand over your weapon and your badge." "Captain, I was just—" "Your weapon and your badge, Hendricks, now." Hendricks's hands were shaking as he unholstered his pistol and removed his badge. He held them out to Torres, his eyes flickering between the captain and the crowd of federal agents surrounding them. "Captain, I didn't know. The system didn't flag anything. I was just doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of their race. Your job is to follow proper procedure, which includes running plates before drawing your weapon. Your job is to treat every individual with dignity and respect until you have actual evidence of wrongdoing." Torres took the weapon and badge, his expression cold. "You failed at all of those things tonight, Hendricks, and you did it to possibly the worst possible person you could have chosen." Two internal affairs officers stepped forward and escorted Hendricks to a waiting patrol car. He would be taken to the station, processed, and held pending investigation. But everyone present knew that his career in law enforcement was over. There would be no coming back from this. Torres turned back to Marcus. "Director Ellison, I know there's nothing I can say that will make this right, but I want you to know that this officer's actions do not represent the values of our department. We will conduct a full investigation, and we will take every appropriate action to ensure accountability." Marcus studied the captain for a long moment. He had heard similar words before. After similar incidents, from similar officials who were genuinely horrified by what had happened, but who were also part of a system that continued to produce such incidents with depressing regularity. He knew that Torres meant what he was saying. He also knew that meaning it wasn't enough. "Captain Torres, I appreciate your words, but let me be clear about something. If I had been anyone other than who I am, if I had been a black man without power or connections, without the ability to summon federal agents with the push of a button, what do you think would have happened here tonight?" Torres didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. "I would have ended up face down on that wet pavement, handcuffed for a crime I didn't commit, taken to your station, and held until someone bothered to verify my identity. Or worse. I might have made a sudden movement that Officer Hendricks interpreted as threatening. I might have reached for my phone to call a lawyer. I might have done any of 100 innocent things that could have been used as justification to shoot me." Marcus paused, letting the words sink in. The rain continued to fall around them, soaking everyone equally, erasing the distinctions of rank and authority and leaving only the human beings underneath. "I survived tonight because of who I am, because of the position I hold and the resources at my disposal. But there are millions of people in this country who don't have those resources, who face situations like this every day, who are treated as criminals simply because of the color of their skin. And until that changes, until your officers are trained to see black citizens as human beings deserving of respect rather than threats to be neutralized, apologies are just words." Torres nodded slowly, his expression showing the weight of what he was hearing. "You're right, Director. And I promise you, this department will do better, starting with a complete review of our training protocols and a thorough investigation of Officer Hendricks' history." "That's a start, but I want more than promises, Captain. I want action. I want to see the results of that investigation. I want to be involved in the review of your training protocols, and I want Officer Hendricks prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Prosecuted? He drew a weapon on an unarmed civilian without justification. He made racist statements during a traffic stop. He violated my constitutional rights under color of law. Those are crimes, Captain, federal crimes, and I intend to ensure that he faces consequences for them. Torres glanced at the FBI agents standing nearby, several of whom nodded confirmation. The legal authority to prosecute civil rights violations rested with the federal government, and there was no doubt that charges would be filed. "I understand, Director. We'll cooperate fully with any federal investigation." Marcus nodded, then turned to one of the Secret Service agents who had responded to the scene. "I'd like to go home now. It's been a very long night." "Of course, sir. We'll escort you." Marcus got back into his Mercedes, still soaking wet, still processing everything that had happened. As he pulled back onto Route 7, flanked by federal vehicles, he thought about the long road that had brought him here. From the south side of Chicago to the halls of the CIA, from a childhood marked by poverty and discrimination to the pinnacle of American intelligence operations. He had achieved more than anyone had expected, had broken barriers and defied expectations, had proven that excellence could overcome prejudice. But tonight had reminded him that prejudice never fully disappeared. It lurked in the shadows, waiting for moments of vulnerability, emerging in the actions of young police officers who couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. It was a hydra that grew new heads whenever the old ones were severed, a disease that infected each new generation despite the best efforts to inoculate against it. He was tired, so very tired. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of turning tonight's incident into something meaningful, something that might prevent the next black man from facing a gun barrel simply for existing. He would use his position, his power, his voice to demand change. He would testify before Congress if necessary, would speak to the media, would do whatever it took to shine a light on the systemic racism that had nearly killed him tonight. It was the least he could do. For himself, for his children, for every black person in America who didn't have the resources to summon federal agents when a police officer decided that their skin color made them suspicious. The rain continued to fall as the convoy made its way through the empty streets of McLean. But somewhere to the east, beyond the clouds, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to appear. A new day was coming, and Marcus Ellison intended to make it count. The arrest of Officer Derek Hendricks was processed within hours of the incident. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. Additional charges of assault, false imprisonment, and making terroristic threats were filed by Fairfax County prosecutors who were eager to demonstrate that local law enforcement took such incidents seriously. The story broke on Saturday morning when a leaked document from the FBI's Washington field office found its way to a reporter at the Washington Post. By noon, it was the lead story on every major news network. By evening, it was the subject of urgent discussions in the White House, where advisors were scrambling to manage the political implications of a CIA director being held at gunpoint by a racist police officer. Marcus gave his first interview on Sunday afternoon, sitting in his living room in McLean, speaking with a journalist he had known for years and trusted to tell the story accurately. He described the traffic stop in detail, from the moment the blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror to the moment Captain Torres arrived and relieved Hendricks of duty. He described the fear he had felt, the calculations he had made, the moment when he had decided to refuse to get on the ground despite the weapon aimed at his chest, and he described the broader context, the reality that his experience was far from unique, that Black Americans faced similar situations every day without the resources to protect themselves. He spoke about his children, about the conversations he had been forced to have with them, about surviving encounters with police, about the burden of teaching the next generation to navigate a world that saw them as threats before it saw them as people. The interview was watched by more than 20 million people. It sparked a national conversation about police reform, racial profiling, and the persistent inequality in how law enforcement treated citizens of different races. Civil rights organizations mobilized, demanding policy changes. Politicians issued statements, some expressing outrage and others defending the police. The country was divided, as it always was when these issues surfaced, but the conversation was happening. Officer Derek Hendricks was held without bail pending trial, his attorney arguing that he had simply made a mistake in the heat of a stressful situation. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Dashcam footage from his patrol car captured the entire encounter, including his racist comments and his decision to draw his weapon without justification. Body camera footage showed his face as he realized his error, the dawning horror of a man who understood that his career and his freedom were about to be taken from him. The investigation into Hendricks's background revealed a pattern of troubling behavior. He had accumulated multiple complaints during his 3 years on the force, mostly from minority citizens who reported being treated with disrespect and hostility. His supervisors had dismissed these complaints as unfounded, had failed to investigate properly, had allowed a problem officer to remain on the streets until he did something that couldn't be ignored. Those supervisors were also placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The Fairfax County Police Department announced a comprehensive review of its hiring practices, training protocols, and complaint procedures. The county board allocated emergency funding for implicit bias training and community outreach programs. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Marcus testified before Congress 2 weeks after the incident, appearing before the House Judiciary Committee to describe his experience and advocate for federal police reform legislation. He sat at the witness table in his best suit, his voice calm and steady as he answered questions from lawmakers of both parties. "Director Ellison," the chairman asked, "you're one of the most powerful intelligence officials in the world. You have resources and connections that most Americans can only dream of. And yet you were still treated this way. What does that tell us about the experiences of ordinary citizens who don't have your advantages?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "It tells us that race continues to be a determining factor in how Americans are treated by law enforcement. It tells us that no amount of education, achievement, or status can fully protect a black person from the assumptions that some officers make based solely on skin color. And it tells us that reform is not optional. It's essential." The hearing lasted 4 hours, covering everything from training standards to use of force policies to the qualified immunity doctrine that protected officers from civil liability. Marcus advocated for specific changes: mandatory bias training, independent investigation of all use of force incidents, a national database of officers who had been fired for misconduct. He knew that not all of his recommendations would be adopted, that the political process was slow and messy and often produced inadequate results. But he also knew that staying silent was not an option. After the hearing, he was approached by a young black congressional staffer who had been watching from the back of the room. "Director Ellison, I just wanted to thank you for speaking up, for using your platform to push for change." Marcus shook the young man's hand. "What's your name?" "Jonathan Williams, sir. I work for Congressman Davis." "Jonathan, can I give you some advice?" "Of course, sir." Marcus looked at the young man, at the hope and idealism in his eyes. at the career stretching out ahead of him. Don't wait for someone else to fight these battles. Don't assume that people in power will do the right thing without pressure. Use every opportunity you have, every bit of influence you accumulate, to push for the change you want to see. Because the people who benefit from the status quo will never change it voluntarily. They have to be forced. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. I understand, sir. I won't forget. Good. Now get back to work. You have a country to improve. Marcus watched the young man walk away, feeling something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The fight was far from over. It would never be truly over, not in his lifetime, perhaps not ever. But each generation that took up the cause that refused to accept injustice, that demanded better from their institutions and their fellow citizens, moved the needle a little bit further toward the world that should exist. He had done his part. He would continue to do his part for as long as he had breath. And when he was gone, there would be others to carry on. The trial of Derek Hendricks began 4 months after the incident. It was held in federal court in Alexandria, just a few miles from where the traffic stop had occurred. Marcus attended every day, sitting in the gallery, watching as the prosecution presented its case and the defense tried desperately to justify the unjustifiable. The evidence was overwhelming. The dashcam footage, the body camera footage, the testimony of Captain Torres and the other officers who had responded to the scene, the expert witnesses who explained how Hendricks's actions violated every standard of proper police conduct, the parade of minority citizens who had filed complaints against him over the years, each telling their own story of harassment and discrimination. Hendricks's defense attorney tried various strategies. He argued that Hendricks had been stressed by a difficult shift, that he had recently gone through a divorce, that he had received inadequate training from the police department. He argued that Marcus had been uncooperative, that his refusal to get on the ground had escalated the situation, that Hendricks had legitimately feared for his safety. None of it worked. The jury, a diverse group of 12 citizens from the